chapter 2, and this story is called The Young Man in the Green Turban. You remember the story of Sheikh Ahmed, who traveled all around the country telling the people that God was sending them a new teacher, and how when Sheikh Ahmed died, he left Sayyid Kazim to carry on his work and to spread the great news of the coming of the Promised One. Perhaps that word Sayyid may seem strange to you. That means a member of the family of Muhammad, that other great teacher who gave us the Quran. Of course, Muhammad lived many years before that, but all the men who were later born in that family were called Sayyids. It was a great honor to be related to Muhammad, even if it was many, many years later. Here is another thing that Sayyid Kazim told the people. He said this divine teacher whom God had promised was living among them at that very time. Perhaps, he said, he was even living right near where they lived, and they didn't even know him. Well, you can imagine how surprised they were to hear that kind of news, and how they must have talked about it and with each other and wondered who he was, where the Promised One lived, how they could meet him. And if you and I had been there too, I think we'd have wondered, wouldn't we? I know I sure would have liked to have met him if I'd been there, and I'd have looked around plenty too. You know, it's strange, but when God sends a new divine teacher to the earth to remind people about God, only a few know him at first. Just think, they may see him on the street or in the shrine where he goes to pray and still not know him at all, because their hearts are not full of love and hope, and they're not looking for him. And some of them, I'm afraid, don't know him because they're so busy thinking about themselves they just don't have time for him. Of course, there are many others who are not like these people, and their hearts are ready because they are expecting him. And Sayyid Kazim was one of those. And he was spending his whole life trying to prepare the other people to know the Promised One when they saw him. And this story now tells about a very happy day in Sayyid Kazim's life. It was the day he first met the Promised One. And he not only met him, but he heard him talk. How thrilled he must have been. Of course, I must tell you something that even Sayyid Kazim perhaps didn't know at that time. God really sent two divine messengers and teachers instead of one. The one of whom Sayyid Kazim was telling them was called the Bab. The word Bab means gate or door. And it was just as if the Bab came to open the door for Baha'u'llah, the other great teacher, who came later. The Bab, of course, was the first. He was the one whom Sheikh Ahmed and Sayyid Kazim were expecting, because they had read about him in the Quran. Well, one morning, very, very early at dawn, before the sun came up, Sayyid Kazim sent a messenger to a friend, telling him that a very important person had arrived in Karbala, where they were living at the time, and that they must visit this person at once. When the friend arrived at Sayyid Kazim's house, he found Sayyid Kazim dressed and waiting at the door, anxious to be on his way, and they walked through the streets together. How quiet it must have been all through the city. The sun wasn't up yet, the people were still asleep, not a soul was stirring. And soon they reached a house where a young man stood in the doorway, as if he were waiting for them. He wore a green turban, and his face was so beautiful and so gentle and kind that it seemed that no one who saw him could help loving him. Haven't you seen people who you liked the very first time you saw them? Well, that's the way they felt. And coming to meet them, the young man put his arms around Sayyid Kazim and spoke to him such words of love that Sayyid Kazim couldn't only stand. All he could do was just stand there with his head bowed. He couldn't even speak. And the young man led them into the house, upstairs to a room decorated with flowers, which gave out a very lovely perfume. And here the young man told them to be seated, and he gave them a drink from a beautiful silver cup which stood in the center of the room. You know, when you love someone very, very much, you feel so happy that you just want to be near them. You don't need to talk. Well, that's the way the two visitors felt that morning when they were in the presence of this young man. Only a few words were spoken that morning, and then the young man led them to the door, and with a wonderful smile, he bade them goodbye. How often the one who had gone with Sayyid Kazim that morning must have thought about that visit. And then, 3 days later, he saw this young man again. Sayyid Kazim was teaching a number of people from the Quran when the young man entered and sat down among them in the class. At once, Sayyid Kazim stopped speaking. When the others asked Sayyid Kazim to continue, he couldn't. He only shook his head. He pointed to the ray of sunlight which came in through the door and fell across the lap of the young man. The truth about the promised one, Sayyid Kazim said, is more manifest than the ray of sunlight which has fallen on this young man's lap. You see, Sayyid Kazim knew who this young man was, and he couldn't understand why the others didn't know him. But still the others did not understand. Not even the one who had gone with Sayyid Kazim early that other morning to meet this young man. Still, in his heart, he had a strange feeling whenever he thought about him. And several times he started to ask Sayyid Kazim the young man's name, but something always seemed to stop him. Well, of course, you've all guessed who the young man was, but the friend of Sayyid Kazim didn't know, even though he had come to love him with all his heart and to think of him many times a day. And one day he heard about a young man who said that he was the Bab, the promised one, and he knew right away, just like that, that this was that young man, the one whom he had seen in Karbala and whom he had loved so very much. Of course, we're going to hear more about him next time. Aren't these stories wonderful? This one is chapter 3, and it's called The Shepherd's Dream. Well, Sayyid Kazim, as you could imagine, was very happy. He not only knew that the promised one had come, but he had seen him with his own eyes and had visited him. What a joy it must have been to tell others about him, even though he was not yet allowed to tell them his name. But would you believe it? He found many who wouldn't listen. You know, it does no good to try to tell something to someone who doesn't want to hear it. Not only that, but sometimes they were very cruel to Sayyid Kazim and to his friends. Sayyid Kazim and a few who were his close friends went right on teaching anyway, just the same, for there were always some who were glad to listen. And he read to them from the Quran the very words which told that there would be 2 great teachers coming. The one whom they were expecting, who would be first, but soon afterward there would be another one. And this last one would bring his light to the whole world, not just to the country in which he lived. So that was a big story. One day at noon, Sayyid Kazim was standing in the shade of a palm tree, waiting for the people to come from the noonday prayer. Suddenly an Arab rushed up and threw his arms around him. An Arab, you know, is someone who lives in or near the great Arabian desert. And it was to the Arabs that Muhammad had come many years before and had given them the holy book, the Quran. Now, here's the strange story this Arab told Sayyid Kazim. Listen. 3 days before this, he said, while he was watching his sheep in a pasture nearby, all of a sudden he fell asleep, and he dreamed. In his dream, he saw Muhammad, who told him to listen well and to remember every word he was told, for these words were sent from God. If you be faithful to them, Muhammad said, great will be your reward. But if you neglect these words, grievous retribution will befall you. That means that great trouble would come if he forgot the message. And then Muhammad told the shepherd to stay near that place. In 3 days, he said, Sayyid Kazim and his friends would come there at noon to pray. The shepherd was to greet Sayyid Kazim and to tell him that his work was almost done, that in 3 days after he returned to Karbala, he would be permitted to go to the one who was speaking, to the next world. And soon after that, the promised one would make himself known to everyone. Now, this meant that in 3 days after Sayyid Kazim returned to his home in Karbala, he, Sayyid Kazim, would die because his work was finished. You see, each of us has a work to do. If we didn't, we wouldn't be here on earth. And Sayyid Kazim was doing his work very well. Well, you can imagine how happy the shepherd's words made Sayyid Kazim very happy. But of course they made Sayyid Kazim's friends sad to think that he was going to leave them or die. When he saw this, Sayyid Kazim said to them, "Isn't your love for me for the sake of the true one, the promised one? Wouldn't you wish me to die so that the promised one might be revealed to all the people?" And Sayyid Kazim talked so sweetly and so lovingly to them, and he made them so happy to think that at last they were going to know the promised one, that they ceased to feel sad because of his leaving. And that's the way it is with us today. We never like to lose a friend, but when we do, God always sends us another one. And so Sayyid Kazim, that wonderful man, finished his work and returned to Karbala. And there, 3 days later, just as the shepherd had dreamed, Sayyid Kazim died, leaving his friends to find the promised one and to tell the people all about him. And they did find him. And that's the story we're going to tell next time. I can hardly wait to hear that one myself.